toprak köpeği kullandılar. Hemen göstereyim. Bak şimdi sonunda şey yapma alışmak gelirken karşılara da yola toprak yürütmesiyle Ukrayna askerleri orada. Ve şu hatta doğru bugün sabahtan ve cümle günü beton bariyerler koydular. Yani burada da hani bu da aslında bir anlamda demirlerin yaklaştığını işareti. İlk geldiğimizde sadece demirler vardı. Demir böyle elle çekilebilen demirler vardı. Sonrasında beton getirdiler, yani en sonunda bunlar döktüler. Yani yolun toprak köpeği parmaklıklarımız var. Kendi adımıza da burada mesela başkentimizde bir yani başkentimizde ama şu anda şöyle söyleyeyim, Moldova'da mesela geçen gün Cumhurbaşkanı bir harita bölümünde açıklama yaptı. Haritamızdan Moldova'da bir bölge var. Orada da transfer arasında bir yer var. Yani Ankara'da sağlık merkezinde yani Rusya yukarıdan kendi pasaport, kendi Yunanistan müdahaleleri var. Yani kendi arasında olan oraları aldı. Onun haricinde aklımızda bağımsız kesmiş bir şekilde Ukrayna. O yüzden her ülkesi oradan saklayacak yukarıdan da Moldova'ya doğru bir şey. Yani ben olan yerlerde çok var. Yani şu anda tabii düşünmüş. Yani başta olabilir ama şu anda Ukrayna sınırında Moldova şeyinde ama şöyle söyleyeyim. Tamamen Moldova'da mesela açıklama yaptı. Onları transfer diye bir yer var. Moldova'da da bir şehir ama kendini cumhuriyet ilan etmiş. Kendi pasaportu, kendi kimliği, kendi parası olan, ciddi diyorum, kendi parası olan ve Rusya'ya bağlı ilan etmiş bir cumhuriyet var. Ve yani çok ciddi bir şekilde bunların bir olgusu da var. Rusya'yla birlikte her yılda bir kere ortak tatbikler yapıyorlar. Moldova'nın ciddi bir şey yok. Ben ilk duyduğumda şaşırmıştım. Hani insanlar orada olmak alan başında orada geleceği güçlü ama tamamen Moldova hiçbir şekilde kabul etmezler. Kendi polisi, kendi askeri, kendi parası, kendi pasaportu var. Hani Rusların onlara getirecek herhangi bir sağlık önlemek için Moldova'da da o bölgeye girebileceğini düşünüyor. Buraya hiç kimse müdahale edemez. Ben size söylüyorum. Savaş çıkarsanız siz çıkar. Şu anda İsveç, Estonya, Romanya, birçok ülke hava sahasını Rusya'ya kapatıyor. Hatta İsveç'te açıklama yaptı. Soğuk uçaklarla hava sahasını iptal ediyor. Yani bu bölgelerde NATO gücüyle Amerika dört parçalı şöyle emperyal büyük emperyal güç şahit etmiyor. Yani Rusya'da bir emperyal yani ne kadar bunu aynı ortamdan sonra hava sahasını iptal Rusya'da emperyal güç yani dört parçalı bölgeler arasında muhakkak çalışacak. Yani bir şekilde buraya Amerika'ya alınmak müdahale edecek bir senaryo lazım. O senaryo işte ben böyle bekliyorum. Yani uçak geldiğinde burada başka buraya hiç kimse müdahale edemez. Ben sanıyorum savaş çıkarsanız çıkar biliyor musunuz? Şu anda İsveç, Estonya, Romanya birçok ülke hava sahasını Rusya'ya kapatıyor. Hatta İsveç'te açıklama yaptı. Kez soğuk uçaklardan hava sahasını iptal ediliyor. Yani bu bölgelerde NATO gücü ya da Amerika Rus uçağı düşünce hani büyük bir savaş bekliyorsa zaten şimdi müdahale etmez var. Yani varsın değil, hazır müdahale bunu ancak böyle yapabilirsiniz. Yani hava sahasını iptal edip kullanan geçer ya da işte Karadeniz'deki gemi batırımlar, işte şunu iddia ettiler, Rusya bir NATO üyesine.
But there's no doubt that so far the Russian advance has gone horribly wrong for Russia. They may still win, but there are reports of Russian troops simply abandoning their trains, trucks, armoured vehicles, just surrendering, caught without food and fuel even. And Russian prisoners that have been put in front of the camera seem untrained, confused, demoralised, very young some of them.
Они хоть... Они чё, блядь, вообще сказали-то нахуй, суки? Вообще же никому по-любому даже похоронка не пришла.
Обманули и хотят пустить как пушечное мясо.
Я не думал, что я буду убивать кого-то. Я не знал, я боялся управлять на войну как пушечное мясо. Всех расстреливать сразу.
Я тебе могу сказать одно, то, что говорили нам, это все пиздешь. Мы здесь вот сидим сейчас, я и кто-то привез. Я могу сказать одно, я не понимаю, нахера все это было сказано, то, что нам говорили там в России.
The Ukrainians are in fact trying to get through the Russian media blockade, trying to stop the news from their own people by getting these prisoners to ring their parents. It is in fact against the rules of war to use prisoners for propaganda, but Ukraine is fighting for its life. We now, though, have another amazing insight into the state of the Russian army in Ukraine. Shadowbreak is a British company whose main game is geospatial, using satellite imagery, and it's somehow managed to eavesdrop on communications between Russian troops in Ukraine, like this one. Joining me from Dubai is Samuel Cadillo, a young entrepreneur and founder of Shadowbreak. Samuel Cadillo, thank you so much for your time. How many recordings have you managed to get?
At this time, we have a few hundred hours and a few hundred files actually as well of recording, and it's still ongoing because they're still talking on open comms.
Now there's a mystery here, Samuel. You would expect the modern army to have encrypted communications, secure lines, that someone like you couldn't just butt in and have a listen. What's gone wrong here?
Honestly, it's a great question. As you said, in 2022, you will imagine that the Russian army has equipments, encrypted communication, because it's the standard for a modern army. And we hope that not the whole Russian army is talking on open comms, and it's some very specific units that are in. But I think it's mainly a logistical issue that those units were sent on the ground without the proper equipment.
And what are you actually hearing on these recordings?
We are hearing literally everything. I mean, we've heard them talking about what they're going to do after they wake up. We've heard them having, jokes. We've heard them crying during fights. And then we've heard them having fuel issue, lacking coordinates. There was an instance where they were trying to communicate with another unit to exchange fuel and food, but they could not tell them where they were because they didn't have a map. So yeah, we've heard like an entire range of things.
So what's that picture telling you? I mean, when they don't have maps, when they've run out of food or fuel, they're having trouble coordinating, they're using just open communication that you can eavesdrop on. What's the overall picture here? I mean, we had the image, of course, of the mighty Russian modern military just steamrolling into Ukraine. You're painting a different picture.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, obviously, so Shadowbreak, we also, have satellite imagery on the top of that. And, when we take everything together, both the radio communication and the satellite imagery that we're gathering, we're seeing not great advancement from the Russian troop. Clearly, they're having a lot of issue, and here it's pure speculation. But to me, it sounds like they were not prepared for the kind of Ukrainian resistance they're facing. Especially because we know Russian capabilities in Syria. We know they're pretty good, actually, in terms of military equipments. But it just seems that what they sent in Ukraine is nowhere near what they could have sent, and it's probably just unprepared for this war. I think they've been so much within their propaganda that Ukraine was pro-Russia that they just thought civilians would open arm, welcome them.
I think you've painted a fascinating picture with your work here. I really appreciate it. I'm sure that I'm not the only one to have appreciated. I'm sure that a lot of intelligence agencies are paying great attention too. Samuel Cardillo, thank you so much indeed for your time.
Hello, good morning. This is Sky News Breakfast, live from both sides of the Poland-Ukraine border as the humanitarian crisis from the Russian invasion grows.
Western Ukraine. From here, tens of thousands of people have boarded trains to flee this country.
And they are coming to places like this, Krzyżanko in Poland, when they arrive as refugees looking for sanctuary. A seventh night of violence in Ukraine, with latest reports suggesting 21 people have been killed and more than 100 injured in shelling in the eastern city of Kyiv. President Biden praises the bravery of Ukrainians and unity of the West in the face of Vladimir Putin's invasion.
When dictators do not pay a price for their aggression, they cause more chaos. They keep moving.
Ukraine's President Zelensky remains in the capital Kyiv, telling reporters he's not seen his family for several days while he defends his country. Edging slowly closer, a huge convoy of Russian armored vehicles is now just 18 miles from the center of Kyiv. The Ukrainian sports stars, including the world heavyweight boxing champion, take up arms to defend their country. Hello, good morning. We're live in Krzyżanko in Poland. This is one of the 8 border crossing points with Ukraine. And over the past week or so, this country has seen 450,000 people forced from their homes in Ukraine, seeking safety here as refugees from the Russian invasion. Overnight, President Biden to say that Vladimir Putin must pay a price for his onslaught on Ukraine as he closed US airspace to Russian aircraft. Well, let's take you through the latest developments. And in the last hour, a Ukrainian official has said that at least 21 people in Kharkiv have been killed in shelling in the last 24 hours. Another 112 people were reportedly wounded. Late last night in Zhytomyr, a city about 85 miles west of Kyiv, 4 people were killed when a cruise missile hit their homes. Ukrainian forces still hold the cities of Kharkiv, Kherson and Mariupol. But local Ukrainian media reports that Mariupol's mayor says Russian forces captured the city's railway station and port last night. Well, the huge Russian convoy of tanks and armor is now within 20 miles of the city center of Kyiv, but has not made significant progress since yesterday.
The aftermath of a Russian cruise missile strike in Zhytomyr, a city 85 miles west of Kyiv, and these are residential buildings near a hospital. Guys, there's a man in this house. Be careful, the firefighter shouts. Ukraine's 95th Air Assault Brigade are based in Zhytomyr. The Russians were likely aiming at them. An Interior Ministry official says 4 people were killed. Ukraine's wartime president, unshaven and tired-looking, as he spoke to reporters.
Work and sleep, that's it.
Can you see your family? Can
No.
you see your kids?
No, I can't.
When was the last time you saw them?
Before this war. No, not before this war. No, 3 days ago. The middle of this war. Yeah.
Then the news that what the Russians had billed as a precision strike on Ukrainian communication networks right by the Kyiv TV tower has hit the Babin Yar Holocaust Memorial Site too.
Babi Yar now it's bombing. Babi Yar? Yes. The memorial? Yes, the memorial which that we made. They started building after 80 years of this tragedy. It's second Babi Yar.
That is Russian. My congratulations.
Thank you.
Все остаются здесь, я сейчас заберу.
Russia is picking up the tempo of its war on its next-door neighbor. 11 people were killed and apartment buildings ripped to shreds in the eastern city of Kharkiv after a barrage of artillery strikes on Tuesday, including this strike on the main government building in Kharkiv's Freedom Square early in the morning. This is a maternity ward in the southern city of Kherson, forced to relocate to a bomb shelter because the sick and those about to give birth just can't leave alongside the 500,000 who already have. Ukraine's health minister posted this picture on his Facebook page of a health worker he says was shot dead by Russian forces as she drove her injured nephew to hospital in Kyiv. To the north of the city, the 40-mile-long armored convoy bearing down seems to have stalled. A US official says it may have logistical issues or fuel shortages. But Kyiv waits for the storm that is to come, 1 week into this war that Russia's president swore he would never wage.
And we can talk to Diana in Moscow now. And Diana, has there been any response from President Putin to the latest comments we've had from America overnight?
No, not yet. He doesn't tend to start talking early. But we can expect some response from the Kremlin spokesman when he has his daily call. And I expect them to be typically pugnacious and belligerent, because I think that is the mood that Vladimir Putin is in now. As far as more developments overnight in Ukraine go, we understand that Russian paratroopers have been having an extensive gun battle in Kharkiv around the military hospital there, but no loss of life amongst the Ukrainian military. But we do understand that 21 have been killed in Kharkiv over the last few days. And as we saw in that report, not much movement of the convoy, which is approaching to Kiev, and a fairly quiet night in the capital. But if you think about the fact that Vladimir Putin has bombed in his first strikes in the center of Kiev the cemetery of Babin Yar, which is a Holocaust memorial to the tens of thousands who were killed by the Nazis during World War II, and that Volodymyr Zelensky is Jewish and that his family members were killed by the Nazis. And Vladimir Putin calls this a denazification program, essentially, in Ukraine. It just beggars belief, the justification that he is trying to sell to his own people about this. Because what we're seeing in Ukraine is a terrible war. And what we're beginning to experience here is an economic war that is going to be incredibly long-lasting, longer lasting than the conflict in Ukraine, which Joe Biden said last night would probably end up lasting quite a long time in itself. But here we're already seeing a lot of people leaving. One businessman said to me, Vladimir Putin has undone the work of the last 20 years. And if you look back at the 90s, at least we had something to hope for, and now we don't. A lot of people saying things like, who would want to live in North Korea? But that's the people who understand the impact of the economic sanctions and what they will mean for the future of the Russian people. But a lot of people don't, because they listen to the state's propaganda and they don't understand what is happening in Ukraine.
Okay, Diana, thanks so much for that. Well, let's look at the latest now assessment from the UK Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, who joins me now. Mr. Wallace, what power do you think the West has to stop what President Putin is doing without starting World War III?
Well, we can help support, which we have done, and the United Kingdom has been in the lead, the ability for Ukrainian armed forces and indeed the whole population to defend itself. That's why we have equipped, actually from a British point of view, for some months the Ukrainians with anti-tank missiles and other weapons systems and non-lethal aid. And that's why last Friday, I hosted a donor conference of nearly 30 countries from NATO and non-NATO to try and collect up as much lethal aid and non-lethal as possible to make sure they can do that. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is, as you've seen across the international community, very, very strong raft of sanctions. You know, we have seen sanctions that I haven't seen before. The Russian Central Bank has been sanctioned. A number of Russian banks with their assets have been frozen. You know, that is going to cost the Russian government and the Kremlin a lot, and it's going to reflect into the economy of Russia almost immediately. I think we saw 20-30% of the ruble's value drop. We saw interest rates nearly double. So the international community has shown how very angry it is with what's going on in Ukraine, both economically and from many of us in Europe, the sort of military point of view. And I think, those two things are one of the reasons why we see the Russian armed forces moving very slowly on its objectives. It is behind schedule considerably. And while we've seen some footage today in Kharkov of Russian forces potentially in the middle of the city, they don't hold the city. It's a city of 1.4 million people, and they are taking casualties, the Russians, and they're finding it very slow going.
We'll go back to what we know about actually what's happening on the ground in a moment. But first, you mentioned sanctions. Do you not think that President Putin will have factored in that there would have been sanctions, and that these sanctions would have been enormous, and that he actually doesn't care about Russia being a pariah state?
Well, I think he probably looked at the sanctions the West put in place in 2014 and calculated with his large cash reserves that he would be able to survive that type of repeat. And while some of those sanctions, even 2014, still exist, I think he probably planned on them being ratcheted up. I don't think he would have woken up earlier, a few days ago and realized and recognized that actually the SWIFT system did manage to kick Russia out and has taken a decision to sanction its central bank. I think that would have been way beyond the expectations of the Russian system. But I think, and on your last point, I think what we have to remember here is President Putin believed that these people would welcome him as a liberator. He was convinced in his own mind, in his own writings, that the Russians and the Ukrainians were the same peoples, and all they were waiting for is the great czars or the president of Russia to come and liberate them. And of course, when you make that assumption, you make all the decisions that we see playing out on our television screens, which is a sort of arrogant armed forces that has got bogged down, ill-prepared young junior soldiers because the officers just thought this was going to be much easier than it was. You see equipment in the wrong places, and I think that's why he is, carrying on as he does. But your very last bit about does he care? Well, he obviously doesn't really care. I mean, when I went to Russia myself, the Russian Ministry of Defense, they were very clear that Russian people could suffer greater than mine or greater than Europeans. We can't be harmed by sanctions. And I remember saying at one stage, I actually don't want Russian people to suffer any more than I want European and British people to suffer. That's my view. None of us should want that, but I think there's definitely a sense of pride that somehow Russian suffering equals Russian leadership, and I think he's about to be shocked, because this is the 21st century, and Russian people, just like European people, don't want to go through what they're about to go through.
In terms of what is happening on the ground, do you have any understanding or any information about why this convoy approaching Kiev appears to have stalled? Is it, do we think, logistical issues, fueling, for example, or getting supplies to them, or is it possibly a tactical thing to wait?
Well, I think it's a combination of all of what you above, effectively. That what we have seen is that they weren't properly, their tactics weren't correct. They were doing things, thought they were rather confident they would take many of these cities in a few hours rather than 6 days or longer. And when any army on the move takes longer to do things, your logistical supply chain is stretched. If you're given enough rations for 2 days and it takes you 6, you've suddenly got a problem. And I think what we've seen is a lot of those issues are coming to bear. They've also been surprised by the Ukrainian strength of the resistance, and indeed, as a result, the Ukrainians have been also carrying out a very clever plan. We've seen footage, we can't verify, but we've seen footage of Ukrainians using UAVs to attack petrol train convoys, to go after logistical lines. We've seen railway lines blown up, all the things that you and I think about when it comes to resistance. So I think that is effectively coming home to roost. But it is also a switch in Russian tactics. I think the Russians have realized that the Ukrainians, by fighting, are costing them lots and lots of casualties, and the Russians have taken significant casualties, far more than they would have planned. And I think what they are therefore doing is trying to switch tactics. And what you're seeing now is those heavy bombardments at night. They'll try, they won't come into the cities as much. They will, I'm afraid, as we've seen tragically, by the looks of things, carpet bomb cities indiscriminately in some cases. They will fly their air at night rather than daytime, because what we've seen is they get shot down in the daytime, and they will try, slowly but surely, try and surround the cities and then either bypass them or bombard them. And I think that is the brutality that I'm afraid we are witnessing, and it's going to get worse. I warned before in your program that is the Russian doctrine is to get harder and tougher and more indiscriminate. And that's why, you know, that tragic strike on obviously the cemetery in the centre of Kiev is exactly what we should expect more of.
Some people believe, you know, you talk about carpet bomb and cluster munitions have been used, thermobaric weapons have been used. Are you confident that both have?
We will collect the evidence on a range of those usage. A number of international partners, such as Canada, are quite rightly putting lots of effort in collecting evidence. If there was any evidence of war crimes, that would be either presented to the International Criminal Court, or indeed countries on their own are free to take certain actions. We have to, war crimes or anything else are done based on evidence. We've seen reports. We've certainly seen the deployment of some of those weapon systems. We haven't verified the use, but that's what we will collect evidence for it. And, some of these weapon systems are horrendous. About a week ago, we summoned the defense attaché from the Russian embassy to the ministry to remind him of his obligations under the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention is there to uphold a humanitarian treatment of both prisoners of war, but also of civilian populations. They have to live up to those obligations, and we will make sure that we hold them to account, whatever happens, whether it's now or in years to come.
Boris Johnson was held to account personally yesterday by a Ukrainian journalist who wanted him to explain to her why Britain can't enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Why can't we?
Well, I've been on your programme about 4 times the last week, and I've explained why. The reason is, I'm afraid, simple, but it is, very difficult to take that course. But it is the course we have to take, which is, if you have a no-fly zone, you have to enforce a no-fly zone. That would involve British fighter jets shooting down Russian fighter jets, probably over Ukraine. That would lead to Article 5 triggering of NATO, and NATO is a self-defense pact. All 30 countries will come to each other's aid. The triggering of that Article 5 would lead to a war against Russia across the whole of Europe. That is not a position that members of NATO are prepared to go. That is why, one of the reasons, Russia does not want countries to join NATO, because once they are in NATO, this self-defense mechanism is strong. It's why we're reinforcing and indeed reassuring our friends in places like the Baltic states who are in NATO but are on the edge of Russia. But that is the reality of it, and we can do the next best thing, and that's not a great comfort, I understand, to Ukraine, but we can arm them, we can support them, we can convene the international community to condemn Russia, to put in very large sanctions, to freeze their assets, to target the leaders of that country. And whatever happens in Ukraine, and I hope Russia sees sense, I hope it realizes this is not a way forward, but whatever happens in Ukraine, the Russian government we see before us today on our television screens will be isolated, and as I think as Diana said in Moscow, Russians were saying we don't want to be North Korea, but if they're not careful, the long-term effect on the Russian government will be isolation.
But it seems to me, as I stand here on the Ukrainian border and watch these families coming across, I saw a family 3 generations coming across a short time ago, the grandmother in tears. You're reminding us all how Britain must play by the rules. But Putin isn't playing by the rules. How far does he have to go in breaking the rules before we take some kind of direct action?
Well, I think the question is, how far does Europe want us to get towards a war across Europe with Russia? How far does the British public want us to go against a nuclear-armed power who may view escalation of all means? So I think we have to be realistic here. Ukraine, and I've said it even before this conflict started, Britain was at the forefront of helping Trump into NATO. It takes all 30 countries to support it. We've had troops in Ukraine through Operation Orbital since 2014, 2015, helping the Ukrainians train. We've trained 20,000 troops to get them up to standard to join NATO. We've done a lot of that, but others wanted to move at a different pace. So the reality is, on the day that Russia invaded Ukraine a week ago, Ukraine was not in NATO. So we have to do everything else in our power to do that. But I'm afraid I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to put at risk the rest of Europe by triggering a major, potentially, war across the whole continent.
Is the UK able to send planes to allow Ukrainians to enforce the no-fly zone themselves?
Well, look, there isn't a no-fly zone, so let's just be really clear here. And the other thing that no one seems to talk about in the no-fly zone is who does the no-fly zone benefit? If you had a no-fly zone in Ukraine, the overwhelming scale of the Russian army would be able to drive around with impunity, which it can't at the moment. You talked about the armoured column, without any air attack from the Ukrainians, because there would be a no-fly zone. So it's a bit like in the Battle of Britain. If we said, "Oh, let's have a no-fly zone," if an unhelpful suggestion came around saying, "Let's have a no-fly zone," that would have suited the vast, German Wehrmacht army. It wouldn't have suited the small, the United Kingdom, who were just not previously just returned back from Dunkirk. So let's ask ourselves, what would it have achieved? You can still have fighting with a no-fly zone, it just won't be in the air, and that would